Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the BCS Author webinar series for the book, The Survivor's Guide to Enterprise Architecture. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, where we are joined by the authors Chloë Gray, Martin Sykes, and Paul Homan, who will be discussing aspects of the book and obviously answering your questions on enterprise architecture and surviving, which is always a good thing. And yeah, we're looking forward to jumping into that. Just so you know, we are recording this webinar so that everyone gets the opportunity to watch it later as well. We'll be able to post that through the relevant BCS channels. And this is part of a BCS publishing series of author webinars. I'll post the link to the other webinars in the chat, but we have topics from architecture to agile and business analysis, cybersecurity, AI, data strategy, and data governance coming up later this year, and we'll be adding more to that list. And also be posting in the chat a link to the book and a link to, which will include also discount code that is available to attendees for today and for the rest of this week to go and buy the book if you haven't already got it. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chloë, Martin, and Paul and turn over to them to start proceedings while I man the Q&A. We'll deal with Q&A at the end, but if there are questions that go on as we move ahead, then the team are quite happy to actually dive in and answer some of those as well. So over to you, Paul.
Hi, yeah, so good afternoon. Thank you, Ian. So we're going to take it in turns just to introduce ourselves, slightly longer than just a straight introduction. If I give a little bit of an introduction about who I am, but kind of like the backstory to why the book for me, and then I'll pass to Chloë and then Martin wrap up, and then we can kind of go through a bit of a session as to work out where you want to take this particular webinar. So my backstory. I almost feel apologetic when I'm saying this now, but I'm a retired distinguished engineer from IBM. I worked in enterprise architecture for quite a long time, both practicing it back in the 90s all the way through to the early 2000s as end user environment, predominantly the Royal Mail, and then worked for IBM advising people and actually going and working as an enterprise architect. And so that was interesting, sort of taking my own medicine. And over that time, kind of collected a bunch of stories and a bunch of anecdotes and experiences through all of that. And that kind of was part of the reason why I got into, okay, I've got a whole bunch of stories, you know, maybe someone might find some of these useful. I used to sort of share them in training and bits and pieces. But the main thing I just want to sort of share up front really was when I first started doing enterprise architecture, which was back in the 90s, and it was a bit of a rare beast in those days, certainly this side of the pond. I kind of reached out. I felt a bit nervous about what I was doing. I'd been appointed the chief enterprise architect. I genuinely actually didn't know what that was when I got the job title. So I had to learn pretty quickly. I joined up with like the open group and sort of found a bunch of people there who were very willing to share and help me try and share their experiences and try and help me. And I welcomed that. I mean, you know, not everything they said kind of resonated, but a lot of stuff did. And that was nice that they were willing to help. Because the main reason was I did it for a little while. And I've said this before, so apologies if anyone's heard this, but the big thing for me was I felt that at any one point in time in that first year or so, and then carrying on from there, every time I got into a role, every time I got in front of a client, but it certainly started off at when I first had the role in enterprise architecture, was that actually the phone was sitting on my desk. And in those days, the phone did sit on your desk. It had a curly coil and went to a handset, would ring, and I would pick it up and it'd be my boss. And at that point, my boss would say, ha, we've found you out. You don't know what you're doing. And in all seriousness, that actually was the feeling that I had. And I make light of it now, but that imposter syndrome is something which I had then, and it kept coming back to me because I kept doubting, you know, is this going to work? Am I going to be able to do this properly? This feels hard. There was a lot of talk about, you know, what should enterprise architecture be like? A lot of talk about frameworks, a lot of talk about best practices and you know, perfect structures and well-populated tools and all this sort of stuff. And for me, what I really wanted back then is a practical guide, something very pragmatic that had a few tips and techniques and coping strategies for how to actually be an enterprise architect. And that, if you like, is the germ of the nemesis of the seed that kind of that set off the whole kind of piece of what this book was about. So hopefully there's a lot of so what in it. So that with that introduction and the setting up for the book, I'll pass over to Chloe.
Thanks, Paul. So you're going to hear a little bit of a similar journey in that EA for me started a while ago, so circa 15 years ago, and it was still quite new then. And actually, if I fast forward to now, it's still quite new now when I have some new engagements. And so my background comes in as a in the trenches EA. So 15 years ago, I was asked by a board member to have a think about setting up an enterprise architecture practice. They knew the term. And I went on the course. I went on a TOGAF course and learned a little bit about it. And over time, I grew the practice. I grew it, and you'll hear a little bit about that, to be a pragmatic set of services that blended well within the organisation I worked within at that point. And then I grew it further within the broader organisation, because we were a collection of organisations, and supported and did lots of useful stuff. And as I fast forward, now traversing from manufacturing industry into finance, I found that actually it's doable. We can do it. We can put a sensible set of services appropriate to the mandate, and we'll talk a little bit about that in this session perhaps, and securing a sensible sponsor that can kind of advocate. And it worked. I traversed manufacturing to finance, and actually EA is EA, and it is something that you just evolve. And then I thought I'd have a bit of a dabble in volunteering community service. I do like giving back, and as a NED to a local school trust, I thought, well, I can apply some of these principles because they're quite common sense to the schooling environment. And then more recently, charity. So the point is, EA is something that can just do some really useful things, but it takes a certain set of competencies, and the book traverses through that, and it's a certain set of recommended things. And to Paul's point, having a book that could have coached me back then, I think would have been really useful. It can be quite a lonely place as an EA, and therefore we were hoping as a collective of enterprise architects with different viewpoints, we could put and bestow some little pointers for you to kind of consider, not copy, but to consider. And therefore began the path where we work together. And I think I'd probably finish by saying my path to this point has probably not been classic, but then what is? And you'll hear from Martin in a moment. And so my background is logistics, it's audit, it's process, and it's people. And therefore that's very different to what you might read out in some job adverts that says you need to be the most technical person in the world. And there comes back to Paul's comment about imposter syndrome. You can easily feel like you are an imposter sitting at whatever table it is you're sat at. And therefore, let's think more about the problems bestowed upon you and how we can be helpful people. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully you can ask some questions that we can kind of prod at, but I'll hand over to Martin.
Thanks, Chloe. I'll take you back to the start of the 1980s. That's when I started writing code on a Commodore PET 6502 assembler language. And I was just hooked on technology. So I did a computing degree, and I was building vision systems, robotic control systems, pharmaceutical automation for drug discovery, which got me by the mid-90s into Glaxo and the research organization. I started doing an MBA when I was about halfway through that as an online MBA, when the opportunity arose and I became chief architect for research on one of the big transformation programs that they were doing. So 27 years ago, and that's it. Claim to be a survivor in enterprise architecture, because once I started doing it, the job title might change, but I've been doing enterprise architecture ever since. In large organizations for the first 2/3 of that, and now in much smaller organizations as well. But a key thing that I think brought me into the book was that, was Chloë mentioned there, giving back a little bit, also starting to reflect on what had worked and what had not worked in conference sessions I was doing over the last few years. So it was October 2023. It's 25 now, isn't it? I'm losing track of the years with the age in this one. We were all at the same conference, but just to give you a hint, we didn't actually meet each other all together. There was multiple separate meetings. We only actually got together for the first time at the book launch last month. Other than that, and that's in person. Other than that, we were all remote, working over Teams and Zoom meetings and talking to each other, putting together our experiences. And I will admit, I've stood on the soapbox and said it should be this way. That was much earlier in the career. Nowadays, I'm far more practical and pragmatic in what enterprise architecture is about. I don't draw anywhere near as many models as I used to, but I spend a lot more time on whiteboards and negotiating and facilitating people to have the right conversation to keep doing things that move us on to the next step. And that's a big part of what's coming out for the book for me as well. Now, there's plenty of theories, frameworks, and all the rest, but where's the bit that actually tells you what it's like to be an enterprise architect? And to keep doing the job over and over again, what we'd all found was it's different every time. There isn't a silver bullet. There isn't a standard career approach that takes you into this. There's a lot more contextually sensitive activities that you do that you might vary quite significantly as you become an enterprise architect in different places. So it has been a brilliant experience writing a book with my two co-authors. And I think we brought many other experiences in from people we know along the way as well. And one of the things that we certainly found is we don't agree. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we do, but because of our different backgrounds and experiences, there are different approaches we would take to different situations. I think Paul would probably agree with me on that we didn't agree. Our experiences have led us down different paths. So one thing we will ask you is, how much do you want to know about what it's like to write a book? And how much do you want to know about being an enterprise architect? Fire that into the Q&A channel. Just give us more about what it's like to be an author in a book, or more about what it's like to be an EA. And we'll take that as a guide for us as to what we talk more about. And while we do, I'll pass back to Paul and I'll let him to start a little bit about perhaps the seasonality of being an architect, because it's not all coming up roses.
Thank you, Martin. So, and just to check, I don't know about anyone else, my chat is not open, so I don't know if people are able to use the chat or not. If there needs to be something that makes it available, mine isn't yet available, or I'm not seeing it. That might just be me.
I have the Q&A open. I'm not seeing anybody adding to it at the moment. I'll add something to the chat just to make sure that's
I can see
working.
it. I can see the chat, Ian.
Okay, it's just me then. It won't let me type anything. That's fine. If everyone else can, that's great. Yeah. So the seasonality is one of those things which appears in the book as a kind of just to talk about, and it isn't really anything other than something to help people get their heads around kind of being an enterprise architect, and one of the things that happens there. So there's a little, there's a picture in the book. I'm not draining it all in a sense, but the reason it came about was I was reflecting sometime with somebody a while back about how being an enterprise architect, sometimes everybody wanted to sort of speak to you. Most often though, people wanted to kind of avoid having to speak to you, to kind of keep out of a governance meeting or a situation, whatever it may be. And the kind of how much you were in demand, how much you were on call for what you were doing changed. It kind of went through periods of high demand and low demand, and it kind of felt seasonal. It felt like it kind of would come and go, especially because through my kind of whole career, we had things like the emergence of COTS packages. I worked in manufacturing, and there were big ERP, MRP packages appearing. And everyone kind of went, well, I don't need to worrying about how we create the data model, because it's all defined inside this particular vendor package. And I don't need to worry about processes, because they're all best processes, all best in breed processes inside this vendor package. the seller told me that, right? And that sort of thing went round and round. And of course, everyone then, we don't need to worry about enterprise architecture because it's done for us. Until that doesn't work, right? Until you realise you've got lots of costs and stuff. And I'm not going through the whole thing, but the point was, when everyone went, well, we don't need EA and Gartner, and I can have a little gentle pop at them because I'm not a client anymore, or even a user, but basically predicted with a 60% probability that EA would be dead by the year 2000, then, you know, fine. Everybody kind of went, well, let's do something else. And we don't really want that team. We don't want to pay for it because these people are expensive and they ask us to do lots of stuff and whatever. So there was a winter. And that winter kind of meant that we were frozen out. But after a while, people realized these things didn't work. They didn't join up. We were still there. Gartner produced a different report. And we basically went and had a spring that turned into a full-blown summer as everyone was trying to join stuff back up. But then the next winter, the next thing to come along, and it was enterprise service buses, and then we had agile and cloud and da-da-da-da, and all these things are coming along, basically have created a winter summer kind of wave. And you know, the kind of, for me, it was really valuable to kind of recognize that pattern, because it always meant that at some point you could have this kind of crisis that, okay, we're going through some, it's a winter, and winter is always followed by a spring and summer. It will happen. You just have to basically recognize that it's seasonal and that not all the time everybody's going to be on board and everybody's with it, and that kind of thing is important. I do think with agile and cloud we went through a particularly deep winter, but one of my favorite stories, and I can't say who it was, but just to sort of throw it in there, post agile, kind of the freezing of ironically all of that kind of architecture piece. I did meet with one particular organization who had said, yeah, for the last year and a half or so, we've got 18,000 developers in 6,000 agile squads creating products. Yeah, we want to talk to you because we want to know, how do we join them back up again? And, you know, I've said it before, but with the absence of time travel, my response was quite short, really, to be honest, in that one. But it kind of, the point was, that re-emergence, the recognition that it wasn't all, you know, thing. And I think that's not so much about organizations, but it's about us as individuals all coping with being enterprise architects, recognizing that the demand changes, the context we're in changes, and that gives us the ability to be able to go with it and cope with it and cope with the job.
Maybe then I build upon that then, Paul, because the seasonality of EA, you talked a little bit about the external environment to that end and the influences, but internally, in my career to date so far, that there have been so many changes too. So, you know, EA becomes something that it needs to be based on the priority, and we talk a bit about mandate. I said that in the introduction, and mandate helps you to understand what it is that you are going to be best at solving. What are the things that are going to be good for you to get involved in? And they may change, and they did when in my career when I worked at Bentley Motors. And indeed, then the type of roles that you engage with, they change too. So, you know, the rise and fall of different types of roles. And at the moment, or should I say in the last 2 years, in my new role, or my newish role, the rise of the product owner has become one. And actually, I think, let's cut to the chase. EA has always been useful, but to differing degrees, and therefore it's about finding your USP and being true to it, and finding a mandate that's suitable to a sponsor, and that sponsor can fly your flag for you and help you traverse any politics, but also to show the value of what you're doing. So I think really it's, for me, about understanding the evolution of a company, the evolution of the roles within a company, the mandates within it, and your sponsor is going to change from time to time. It did do in the last 3 years at Nationwide. And so it's about traversing that change. And I think the last point I'll mention before handing over to Martin is, during those changes in your organizations, your role and the amount of things that you do in your quite diverse role as EA will change too. So you might be an analyst for a period of time, and that's where you're embedding your value there. But it might be that a really strong part of your role is facilitating and getting people to agree on things and to see things in a way that will help them come to a conclusion or decision. Or it might be that you lead and you're leading transformation through the lenses of enterprise architecture. And my final point would be, sometimes you don't even talk about it being enterprise architecture. And certainly the two organisations I'm advising at the moment in the community, you wouldn't say enterprise architecture, you would scare people off. So it's about being useful and being structured in how you're useful. Over to Martin.
Well, it's an interesting one, that not talking about enterprise architecture. I won't name the organisation, I don't want to embarrass them on this one, but when they hired me, they'd had an enterprise architect previously who they'd fired about 12 months earlier, because basically he'd stood on the soapbox and told them how it should be and how things had to change, and this is how they were going to follow the processes. And he didn't get very much done, but he wound a lot of people up. So they decided they didn't want enterprise architecture anymore. And it took them a year before a couple of the senior folks said, we really need somebody who can work out how all this stuff fits together. So in interviewing me, we started talking about it. They were quite clear not to use the phrase enterprise architecture, but we're talking about somebody who knows about architecture, could coordinate architecture, could facilitate architecture. Okay, and I did ask the question, so are you talking enterprise architecture? And one of them said, whatever you do in the next interview, don't mention that word. We're not using that phrase anymore. It's poisoned in the organization. And in the years that followed, we did enterprise architecture. We did all the way through from the analysis side and all the different layers of architecture as well, with many different types of architects on the team. Didn't matter that we didn't call it that. It's something that we had to do. So yeah, some organizations have been bitten or burned badly by taking the wrong approach at the wrong time or with the wrong people. And a different approach with those people might have worked beautifully. You don't really know. So when we put the book together, we actually thought about 5 different sections. And beginning has in brackets after it as the first section, again. Because typically if you're doing this in a career, you are going to begin again multiple times. Sometimes you'll be going in to what you might almost consider a greenfield site. They don't have anything that you would consider enterprise architecture currently. They might have had it in the past, but it's got so outdated that anything you might consider materials of enterprise architecture don't exist anymore. Doesn't mean to say they don't have an architecture, they do. They just don't have it written down and understood what it is for other people to be able to do something with it. Everybody has an architecture for their organization. The difference is whether you've got something that you can actually use to do current planning with and work out what you've got, or whether it's out of date in terms of materials you're working with. So we begin again. We then have a section on doing. What does it actually mean to do architecture? We don't get into saying, oh, do this and do that from a framework perspective, but what are the things we have done as architects in different contexts, and how do they fit together to be able to deliver value? A section on managing. Both managing yourself if you're the only person there, managing others, managing a team of architects, what it actually takes to look after both the governance, and that can be a dirty word in some places. Don't use governance. We don't like being controlled. You don't want to become the architecture police unless you have to in some places. And then a section on being. Probably for the last decade or so, the soft skills of enterprise architecture have popped up more and more at the conferences. But they're not soft. They're not easy. Communication, facilitation, negotiation, all the key soft skills, how you act as an agent of change, are actually the really hard stuff. That's what really attracted me in many ways to being an enterprise architect. So while I was doing my MBA and got the particular role, I realized enterprise architecture challenges are much more complex than the technology challenges I was dealing with, because it's full of people who don't do what you tell them to do, or have their own ideas to go into other things, of ingrained processes. And in some organizations might have been run the same way for the last 50 or 60 years, and they don't see the need to change, through to teams all going off with the same idea but in different directions at the same time. And then our final section, surviving. Those final hints and tips that we thought about that actually says, what have we done or experienced that allows us to keep doing this job for decades? And why do we keep doing this job? And as I think we can also say, it can be one of the loneliest jobs you have in an organization, one of the most taxing and stressful jobs sometimes, trying to pull the threads together and weave from the many different colors of thread and types of material into some tapestry that actually looks like it makes sense for everybody and doesn't fall apart the first time somebody pulls on it. So that's our overall structure. I'm surprised we're not seeing any questions yet or any responses. So I'm hoping people can post something. But if you do want us to talk in a particular direction, put something in there, because we can talk about any aspect of enterprise architecture.
Martin, I'm not sure if you can see them, but I can. So we do have a couple of questions already available for you. So, I mean, the first one, I'm going to slightly broaden it. It's how do you think we should understand the differences between and see the relationship between enterprise architecture and business architecture?
I'm glad it's Paul's turn to talk.
A perennial tangent. So a couple of things for me. One was, I mean, I have my own sort of view, and I'll answer that directly just to kind of put it out there. But I don't like to see them separate. I think if you draw organizational divides, then by Conway's law, you end up doing separate things. So I like to see them housed in the same place as with people, practitioners. I mean, people have different skill sets. There are people who are stronger at data, people who are stronger at technology or security or business processes or whatever it may be, or business architecture in a wider sense. And I think that's good, because a team should have all those kind of multifacets and those kind of different skills. You know, no one person is going to be able to be the goalkeeper, the striker, the midfielder, the coach, the guy with the bucket, right? So the whole thing is it needs complementary skills to a piece. But I don't like to divide it up, because I think it's it will create the divide. That's not to say there's rights and wrongs. That's my kind of coming in position. However, there's also an awful lot of energy wasted within the architecture community, and I include enterprise architecture, information security, actually worrying about that internally. And it is part of the attrition process. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we don't get into attrition, because I had a lot of fun quite a few years ago playing with Sun Tzu's Art of Architecture, Art of War. I did an Art of Architecture, kind of, silly title. But basically, one of the things I remember from that was that, you wait whilst your two enemies, in this case, kind of beat each other up and attrition each other down, and then you kind of step in and win. And I was seeing architects, whether they were business, enterprise, information, security, whatever, competing and wearing each other down. And the only person that was the winner was the project manager, our overall nemesis, right? So I'm a fan of, let's not consume too much energy worrying about some of these definitions and things when it comes to the practicalities of it. It has its place. There are things you can scholarly study, but in the practical application of it, I think it's more important to work out what's needed at that point in time. And that comes back to that mandate. But so there you go.
And so I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Martin, you said we disagreed. I do agree with a lot of the things we've talked about. And therefore, when it comes to differences, and I think I could wrap in the other question, Ian, to a point that's been posed about service designer and the overlaps between service architecture as well. And I think it all depends on what the organisation is requiring of you in your role and your counterparts. If I go back to the question of product ownership, again, it depends on what their mandate is and whether it's feasible for them to work on all the aspects that they can. Let's face it, organisations are very, very complex, and therefore I've learned over the years that to be relaxed to a point. I know what my skill sets are, and I know what my core competencies are, and I know what value I can add. And it's about transposing that and explaining it, the value of EA, in a manner that negotiates between all of these boundaries that are caused by organisations. So business architecture is very much something I look at, but it's something that a counterpart of mine might not. And therefore, it's about understanding the viewpoint Usually there is a USP, a unique selling point to each of those roles that is more prevalent. So a business architect might be more directed at looking at the strategy side of things, whereas an enterprise architect role is looking at the orchestration throughout the whole stack, if you think about TOGAF. My point is, it just depends on what your organization's attempting to do, and then negotiating that with your sponsors to understand, right, well, this is what I need to do, so that there is a clarity. I agree, Paul, boundaries are divisive. I do also sense that actually we need to know what we're doing. So therefore, from a service design perspective, I would suggest that's more niche to a specific service and the architecture that's connected to it, rather than enterprise architecture being more enterprise driven. However, Tiro, if your organization is predominantly service orientated, then the position of enterprise architecture may be wrapped within it. So again, I'll come back to it depends, and be strong to your mandate, what you need to and want to achieve, and what your team can achieve, and the relationships that you build. So I wouldn't have been able to build such a strong enterprise architecture practice at Bentley without a very strong network of affiliated roles, because the people is power in this. So you have to be able to take them on a journey. And I think the last anchor I might come back to in this particular part of answering, or starting to answer that question, is that of language. I think the language we use is incredibly important, not just in how you sell your service, but how you actually engage your service into the different stakeholders you have, and the type of views you might use. And therefore, back to business architecture, the likes of business capability models in comparison to technology capability models, that becomes a very powerful mechanism. I personally use TCMs, technology capability models, to engage with tech folk. I use business capability models to engage with business folk, but only to a point, because actually depends what type of language they use. So it depends comes a lot. Helpful, maybe not. Back to Martin, see if you can pull us in.
So I think negotiation and facilitation are key roles for key activities an enterprise architect would do, key hats we put on. Not just when we're looking across our organizations to work out what to do, but with everybody else that's doing a similar type of job, where they might have a different focus or area of speciality. So business architects spend a lot more time looking at the business's architecture without considering quite as much the technical side. I don't have the bandwidth, the mental capability to be able to hold the whole organization in all the layers from end to end in my head and know, this bit goes here, that bit goes there. I can't even remember where all the models are to follow them through. And no matter how good the repository is, I'm never going to be able to use it to have some aha moment that understands the whole of the organization. There's a phrase Paul gave us during the writing of the book: enterprise architecture is more than a single headful. And that counts both for all the materials we have to have and everything we're expected that you could be asked about your organization. So the relationship between enterprise architecture and business architecture, they're very tied together. Depending on the context of your organization, either loosely connected or so tight that you're probably seeing each other every other day to talk through things. But as an enterprise architect, I'm not going to get to the depth of understanding of what the business architects have. But I need to be able to negotiate with them, facilitate with them the conversations that have to be had across all of the parts of the stack, and potentially between a domain they might have. I know some large organizations have business architects focused on business areas. So there might be supply chain business architect, a central services and finance type business architect, a marketing business architect, because they've got real business domain knowledge as well. And you can have technical architects at different parts of the technology space. One of the challenges of being an enterprise architect is how to make sure you can start at the top of the 30,000 foot view and tie that together. So you get your bird's eye view and the worm's eye view, right down as low as possible what's actually happening to the individual people in the business with what they're doing where necessary. And make sure you can go from 30,000 foot to ground level and back up again on that bungee multiple times a day in conversation with all these other experts, so that you can actually facilitate a better outcome that would have happened if you weren't there. And to me, that's one of our success points. There's a better outcome happens in an organization because we take part than would have happened if we didn't take part. And our job is to pull lots of those pieces together. And that's then true for service design as well. How do the two overlap? Find the points where you get the best value by actually bringing in the skills of the enterprise architect with the skills of the service designer to actually say, well, if that's what you want to do with your service, the bit you might have missed is over here. And that's something that's either going to break your service or some components you might need to understand within that whole service design that you want to work with. And we're not talking service oriented architecture. I totally get that, service design as what service a business might be building at a business level, value chains, all that sort of stuff you could be putting together with it. So yeah, they're two sides of the same coin when you consider the coin is how to design an organization to work more effectively. But we bring different tools and techniques into that, I think, as well.
And Paul, just to clarify, the second question here was seeing service designers and EA as two sides of the same coin, and how could they work better together in designing services and service architectures. So that was the additional one that Chloë and Martin have already picked up on, but you haven't had the chance to yet. Whether it has any additions to what you said, it feels to me like it's pointed towards what tools can I use here, but I wonder what you thought, Paul.
Okay, yeah, I can't see the question. I mean, to be fair, I'm just going to come back to one thing I think that's relevant for all of this, and it was a big part of where we were in the book, and something that we kept coming back to in the book, and that we were sharing. Yeah, they're different views, and sometimes those views were formed because we'd researched something. Often it was because we'd experienced different situations, right? So our nurture, as much as the nature, conditioned our opinions. And so more generically rather than specifically, because I think the others have answered it very well, to be fair, and I don't want to kind of go through the same piece. I think mandate is something we championed a lot in the book. And actually, when you really, it's easy to gloss over it and kind of go, oh yeah, okay, you mean you write down why you're there, fine. But genuinely, if over the last 30 odd years, and certainly when I was acting as a consultant, it's one of those ones that if I'd had a penny for every time I'd picked up a presentation from somebody that told everybody else in their organization why they should all love enterprise architects and how good the enterprise architecture function was and why they needed it, then I would have retired far earlier. But the point is, actually, a lot of people get lost and try and pick up what should it look like? What does an external organization, what does somebody else say it should look like? Where was a success story that was so good, I heard it at this event, look like, and how do I copy that? Well, that's not going to necessarily help, because you're never going to be in the same organization at the same time with the same context, the same external environment again. Every situation is unique. And what you have to be able to do is have a mandate that says why you're there, agreed with key stakeholders. And actually, if that includes stepping into elements of service design and capability management, if it doesn't, then fine, peace. It's about making sure you've got a bought into mandate and that you can work from that for that context in that organization at that point in time.
So perhaps I'll take it one step further, because I noticed no more questions, but please do put the questions in if you want to steer us a different way. But I'll build from that point that Paul's just picked up on, and build it into what's the problem you're trying to solve. As an EA, I often am trying to scope the work so that the right outcome is achieved, and sometimes that outcome doesn't come, or the definition of the outcome doesn't come from the business. They often don't know what it is they're wanting to achieve, just where they're going. So it's about trying to look at it in a slightly different way. And therefore, I do focus quite heavily on defining what the question is that we're trying to answer. What is the problem we're trying to correct? And who might be needed along the way to do that? As I reflect on the inevitability that sometimes as an enterprise architect you can be drawn into many things, and we talk a little bit about this in the book as well. You know, that you can often be a very useful person that's overused, and your value diminishes slightly from that because it's not clear what your offering is. Then I revert to very classic ways of creating a contract with the business or the person asking for some support. So statement of architecture work I've reinvigorated over the last 2 to 3 years to be very clear about what it is that I can do and what it is I can't, and that builds in then, you know, flavors of how much your team does and how much it doesn't, and looks at the portfolio of work and then attaches it to value and then to the mandate, and you're going back to the sponsor and ensuring that the value is there. And I think the other point I'd like to pull out at this point is as we move away from understanding the problem, the next issue we have, that's sort of the problem statement, the next issue we have as an enterprise architect then is inertia. And we talk a little bit about this in the book too, and the foibles that we have, and ivory tower, that kind of thing. And for me, you have to release often. So don't sit on your work. Even if you're concerned it clashes with another piece of work, you know, it's about agitating to a successful outcome, and therefore iterating often is important. So I think it's important to not dwell on too much on what it is that you're worried about in terms of overlaps with other parts of the organization, and carrying on, because my experience of the last 15 years is that I've sustained a good value proposition throughout all of those winters.
Yeah, there's a few points for me to pick up here. I've been making little notes so I don't lose track of them. Let's see if I can thread them back together. Your mandate is not your job description. I've seen people hit that falsely in the past and say, oh, my job description says this is what I've got to do, and they've got the list of 20 things that somebody wrote when they were hired or put into the job. You must do these models, you must do this, you're in charge of that board. That's not your mandate. Your mandate might change every few months according to what the organization really needs you to do. Yes, it'll draw from the things that's in the job description, but a mandate is much more about what actually adds value and what do you choose to put on your to-do list. And I do suggest to every enterprise architect, you should have a do not do list. The things that you have consciously chosen you're not going to participate in, the sorts of things you don't need to do now because they don't fit your mandate. It's all too easy to sit there thinking, oh, the job description, the framework all says I need one of these models, or I should do a capability model. Only do a capability model if you know what you're going to use it for. Only do it to the level of detail necessary for the outcome you want to get. If I look back over the last 10, 15 years, most of my work has not gone any further than the week or two after we created it, because it was valuable for the immediate next set of decisions. There's a very small number of things that have proved valuable in the long term. The stuff that gets published, the stuff that gets retained, the stuff that maintains the direction. But I could have saved myself so much more time if I'd just taken a picture of the whiteboard at the end of a meeting, sent that out to everybody and said, this is the bit we've agreed on. Moving on with that. Knowing that once you've taken that step and you've gone into the next piece, that's built in to what you're doing by default. You might need to improve its communication and set it up a little better later. But a heck of a lot of what we do is just necessary to get the next set of decisions done the right way and to bring the people together. And I have to keep reminding myself, stop polishing it, publish it, whatever state it's in, put it out there, get the conversations going, get the people engaged with it. If it's not right, help them fix it for you. Get them to become co-authors. And then the ownership moves with that. And with the ownership moving to other people, the influence goes with it as well, because it's now something that they've worked on and it ripples through. All too often, there are nowhere near enough people who know what to do with architecture or to do it, the architecture work, than there is work to be done. So you've got to co-opt the mental brain power of many other people to be able to get involved and get on with it. So I want to go back to that do or do not do. What's on my do not do list? Because there's a beautiful quote by Yoda. Do or do not. There is no try. It's sat on my wall up here. There's a variation of that for an enterprise architect. Do or do not. You have the choice. Don't assume that you have to go doing things just because it says so in the books of frameworks, etc. There are a few things you can do that make a massive difference. Don't waste your time on the stuff that doesn't make a big difference. Then you'll survive in the job and you'll keep doing it. And I can see Paul agrees with some of it and not with some of the other bits there, so I'll let him carry on.
No, well, you know, that actually sets it up really, really well. Because when part of what I think is worth sharing is when we first started exploring kind of, you know, what we wanted from a book, we were in accord that what we wanted was something that was useful for lots of people at different stages of their career. You know, whether it was like, oh yeah, actually, it's worth me a bit of a refresh. I've done this a dozen times, but it won't harm to have a checklist to go back and kind of collect my thoughts, through to somebody who's interested in starting out. And that collection of thoughts was sort of formed around certain headings, but we didn't always agree exactly what the best approach should be or how you should do that. But what we did agree is that you should have some way, some resources to think about, something that's going to prompt you, something that's going to help. You know, I mean, the releases one, I mean, just to kind of, you know, indulge me slightly, I can remember, and this was a real crushing moment for me. I mean, it genuinely was. I just started at IBM. I was a week in, and I'd been brought in as an enterprise architect from outside to a particular organisation, as a kind of advisor, and I'd been bigged up by the person selling me in, perhaps overly bigged up, I'll be honest. But you know, it was where like come in, and I sat in front of this chief architect, and they steepled their fingers in front of me, and they kind of went, so you've been doing this for 6-7 years yourself. What is the one most important thing you would recommend? And I was like, well, I'm on the spot now. Now, bear in mind, I was 1 week into my consultancy career. I'd never done it before at that point. And all eyes were on me. I felt a lot of pressure. And I went, well, you know, releases. And I genuinely believe that there is something in that it helps people, right? And it worked for me a few times. I've seen it work in a few times since. I've also seen it fail a few times, as you know, context. But without telling you the detail of what it is, it's in the book if you want to find out. You know, I said releases, and I explained a little bit to this particular person what that meant, and they just sat back and went, no. And I was crushed. I was totally crushed at that moment. I was thinking, I wonder if my old employer would have me back if I phoned them up right now, because I'm really not feeling very confident that I've made the right career swap. And they said no. If it was that simple, we'd have already done it. And my point behind this, what we've collected in the book isn't a start at page 1, read it through, and you'll have a perfect world and you'll go home and sleep lovely and everything will be wonderful. What we've got is a whole series of little pieces that sort of you can pick and try. A kind of like, yeah, I'll give it a go. And I'm a big fan of releases. I would advise anyone to give it a go. I'm not going to tell you it's 100% nailed on guarantee it'll work. What I am going to say is I've seen it work far more often than not, and it will work for a lot of people again. And therefore, it's a technique, it's a coping mechanism that is worth a try. Not in all situations all the time, but it might work for you. And you know, and it might work in a different context for you at a different time. And that was, I think, a really important part of like what we collected, is we could all agree all these things could be useful in different contexts. And we wanted to kind of pass that on, be helpful in that way.
Excellent. There aren't any other questions, but I sort of have a question, if it's okay. I'm not sure if I can form this fully, because it's like a feeling more than a thought. But it is kind of like, what if you're looking forward to the next 5 years? You know, the job market is potentially undergoing a lot of disruption. You know, what are the key skills you should be looking for to learn as an enterprise architect, or someone coming into enterprise architecture, to give you the best chance of survival?
Key skills. So I mean, as we've explained already so far, the skills haven't changed massively in the last, well, for me, not in the last 15 years. There have been influences and winters that we've had to traverse and weather. But the core skills of being able to communicate, being able to understand problems, being able to facilitate groups of people together, to understand where they're going to, where they're coming from, and how they get there, remain for me really, really important things. We, in one of our recent webinars, discussed a little bit about AI and how that might influence, and concluded actually that's another thing, it's another potential season, or it's another potential aspect that we will leverage as a tool, and it might help us as enterprise architects, and it will help, of course, as a vehicle to enable people to do their jobs better. And that's effectively what we're enablers of change. So being a change practitioner for me is quite important, being able to weather the change and be consistent in moving forward. I think things like theory, we touched upon that right at the beginning, is important, and the skills you can achieve by knowing the theory and deploying it flexibly. So I mean, my governance practice is flexibly compliant. I know I can't be the police. Martin suggested that earlier, but I know I need to be able to support compliance. So realise I'm talking around skills there, but it's quite a difficult one to answer, other than talk about the soft skills and then reference the hard skills you see coming through things like some of the frameworks that we see. Martin?
I definitely think some of the soft skills are the ones that play to our advantage as an enterprise architect, working at many different levels in an organization and bringing people together. So whilst we can certainly see with the technology direction we're getting right now, machine learning in its many different forms is going to have a massive impact. It already is doing in organizations. It wouldn't be too surprising in the next couple of years to find that most organizations have got more AI modules running than they have employees making real business decisions, not just sitting there advising, but actively taking the data feed, making decisions based on them, pushing it through. We're already seeing with MCP and stuff like that, they're orchestrating them. You've got whole communities then of expert AIs or machine learning modules being threaded together. Well, that's just another wave of technology from one perspective. But from another, its pace of change is huge. Its disruptive element to our people and our processes is huge, all the way through the supply chains. So you're not going to be able to map it all out and keep track of it. I can already find that in some of the organizations, people I'm talking to. But what you can do is keep a focus on what's the right things to do, where are the right places to put it. And as an enterprise architect, have that conversation properly with the people in the organization. So negotiation, facilitation, the change management aspects. Lots of stuff that we've spent time doing over the years, creating models, drawing them, laying them out, putting the things on there, the heat maps and all the rest of it. Some of that stuff used to take days or weeks to try and get a single page sorted in the past. And some of the stuff I'm seeing now does it in minutes, and certainly can do sentiment analysis and read through content for you. How do you know it's right? There is so much rubbish that gets created from the AIs, or things that are almost right but slightly hallucinated. One of our key skills is going to be keeping that balance of the critical thinking and being able to actually challenge almost every sentence you're reading to say, has that taken into account the context we've got here, brought in the information necessary? Because everybody else we work with is going to be getting that same sort of data set just as fast, if not faster than any time we've ever had it in the past. It's not just a search engine anymore when you type something on the internet. It's searching, it's consolidating, it's feeding it back to you. It's sometimes even writing the email you want to send to your boss to propose the next activity, and it's got all of the pros and cons sitting in there for you in one go. As the enterprise architect, if we're going to do our job well, we've got to be able to read that sort of stuff and respond with the critical thinking arguments of, well, is it the right way to go or not? And how does it fit with everything else we're trying to do? And like everybody else, I'll be using those AI tools myself with my own prompts to help me do the same sort of research, to pull it together, to point out for me the things I might need to be looking at. So key skills are all the softer ones, because I think a lot of the more technical skills that we've had to have in the past are going to go the way of the dodo very fast. They're still necessary out there, but whether they're the ones we should be focused on, I don't think so quite so much. Paul?
Yeah,
But
well,
you
just
now, being the newly retired, obviously you don't have to worry about it too much.
I still worry about these things. You know, I sleepless nights. But the, I mean, but I have never been a fan of, and maybe it's because of my own limitations, been a fan of, these are the technical skills you need to keep on top of. I mean, I can remember being completely, you know, kind of exhausted by the idea that people were criticizing me as an enterprise architect because I hadn't learned how to do Python, right? I mean, I did Algol and COBOL back in the day. I've done enough programming to get an idea, but I haven't kept up with every single programming language. Some people would say I needed to, some say I did, but personally, I did. If you try to keep up with every technological change, there will be some rare people who are really good at it. I couldn't keep up with that level of depth. There's just too much, and it comes, you know, it's way too much. And yes, people might expect it, but I think if you set that expectation on yourself, then you're going to give yourself a really hard time. So I think it's about being truthful and honest to yourself about what you can keep on top of from a skills point of view. I think, you know, the soft skills, absolutely, they will persist. I think they'll change slightly. I think fact finding and truth is, as sort of Martin referred to, 100%. There's so much noise, right? I'm going to put out there that knowing what is the truth and being able to worry about that, I think, is going to be a key area of critical systems thinking. But I'm going to add in a couple of little things. One is I'm a believer that actually a lot of enterprise architecture historically has ended up becoming focused on internal organizational efficiency. How efficient can this process be? How many few instances of this technology can we have? How reconciled can we have certain customer records, whatever? And that's all goodness, right? I don't have a problem with that, but it's very inside four walls. And I actually think going forward, the wider ecosystems point, something that I've been involved with separately, is really actually where a lot of enterprise architecture skills should be pointed. How do organizations work best with other organizations, other entities, and deliver value propositions to people? And I think that's going to become, it relies on a lot of the similar skills, a few more, but I think that's a lot of where trying to understand how that whole dynamic is going to work going forward and how we interact and everything is going to be key. But the biggest one I'm going to say is a skill to kind of make sure people have got is personal resilience, because I think that's what's going to be needed. That's when you have the winters, you've got to survive them. So, and I think that's going to become ever more important. Be kind to yourself and understand how to be resilient is going to be the bigger and bigger, more and more important, because frankly, no one else is going to give it to you. So that's the skill I would go with.
Thank you very much. We've just about reached the time limit. So if there's any additional questions, I'd like to simply thank Chloë, Paul, and Martin today for their input. And thank you all for your questions as well. It was actually a really interesting discussion. If you want to see any more of the authors, there is the IRM Business Architecture and Business Process Management, or Enterprise Architecture and Business Process Management event coming up in June. That's, I think, from the 16th and 17th of June is the conference in London, which is a great event. It's actually one of the events that managed to get them all aligned through in terms of commissioning as authors. So it's a great opportunity to learn more and communicate with other enterprise architects who are in similar industries and going through similar challenges. There's more, obviously, from the BCS author webinar series coming up in about 2 weeks' time. We've got Agile BA and further events later this year. And obviously, if you've not seen it already, there's a link to the book and a discount code available for this week only for discounts on the book. So finally, I'd like to thank Chloë Martin and Paul. Thanks again for your input. We love it. And thanks to everybody who's attended today. I hope you've walked away with a key learning point covered off. And see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.